Okay, well, welcome. This is the third episode of the series on YouTube and a podcast called Ideas and Lives. It's about people with compelling ideas and interesting lives.
It's also known as the Bob and Zvi Show.
And the Bob and Zvi Show. And Zvi, maybe you'll tell our viewers and listeners what it's about.
Sure. We have, in our long lives, had the privilege of knowing some really interesting people who had really interesting careers. And they are, for the most part, still our friends, unbelievably. In fact, even good friends. And so we decided to exploit the new technology of Zoom to create our own webcast. And so far, we've had two friends, and now the third, Jack Habib.
Well, yes, and the two friends first was Mayor Cohn, who gave us his take on view of economic growth based on pre-industrial economic history. And then we had Leonard Hausman, who's had lots of linkages with the Middle East and with China. And if you want to find those, you can just Google either YouTube channel, in quotation marks, Ideas and Lives, or for the podcast, Anchor, in quotes, Ideas and Lives, and you'll get to those episodes. But today we're delighted to have Jack Habib, an old friend of both of us, who has led a very interesting life, leading the premier institution for social policy in Israel, and has played a big role in lots of initiatives that have taken place in Israel over the last 30, 40 years. Jack, welcome to Ideas and Lives.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be part of this series.
Well, so Jack, way we've done it before, we've started more with the ideas. Of course, ideas and lives are intertwined, but maybe you could lay out how you're seeing the evolution of social policy in Israel. It's a big topic, but we want, you can be expansive, but not too expansive, and how you see things emerging today.
Well, if we go back to the establishment of the state, Israel from the beginning viewed itself as a socialist country. And the first government of Israel, 1948, declared that it was a socialist state. So the basic notion of a commitment to social values and to addressing social problems was very much inherent in the establishment of the state. Throughout its history, with ups and downs, been a critical part of the development of Israel's policies and of the story of Israel. I don't know if all of our viewers know, but when Israel was established in 1948, it became a country which consisted of 3 or 4 major groups. One group were the Arab Israelis that had lived in the borders of the new state of Israel prior to the establishment of the state. A second major group were the immigrants to Israel before the establishment of the state, what they called, like to think of themselves as the pioneers who dreamed of the establishment of the state and made a commitment to come to Israel and become part of the establishment of the state from many different countries in the world. The third group was the massive, after 48, was the massive immigration of survivors of the Holocaust, hundreds of thousands of people pouring into the country from all the various parts of Europe. And the fourth group were, during the same period between 1948 and more or less 1960, the massive immigration to Israel of the Jewish communities that had lived throughout the Middle East. The Egyptians, the Iraqis, the Moroccans, the Tunisians, the Syrians, all of the various countries in the Middle East had significant Jewish populations, and they also came pouring into the country as life became more difficult for them in their countries of origin and sometimes very dangerous after 1948. So Israel became this huge melting pot with very little resources and a small group of, I would say, more stable, educated pioneers who had come to establish the country, and masses and masses of destitute, very often very, very sick and needy immigrants pouring into the country. So that's the beginning of the story. And then throughout the years, there was the process of the development of the state of Israel. And that was accompanied by some very, very rude interruptions, such as the Sinai War, in which the life of Israel as a country was put at stake, the 1967 war, when the life of Israel as a country was put at stake. And so the effort to deal with this huge, huge social challenge of dimensions, I think that, I don't know if any other country has faced, was accompanied by the need to constantly deal with the very, very major security situation of the state of Israel. So this brings me up to 1969, when I was a student, had finished my MA at Harvard University. And this brings me to the time I was finishing my MA and looking for a PhD topic. And I was very interested in the whole field of economic development. As a younger man, I had always dreamt of joining the Peace Corps, and that whole issue of addressing economic development in poor countries in the world had really interested me. And then came the shock of the 1974 war, and
The Yom Kippur War.
73 war, 1973.
1973.
October
1973. 1973, when Israel was attacked so seriously, and the concern, my feelings suddenly for Israel became so great. I've always had some kind of an interest, but never any involvement in any kind of Zionist activity of any kind. But this really awakened in me a real concern for the state of Israel and a desire to do something to contribute to it. So I decided to try and go to Israel and do a PhD on some major issue facing Israel. However, because of my interest in economic development, I decided to choose a topic that related to the agricultural revolution that had occurred on the West Bank after Israel became, as a result of the war, after the West Bank had become under Israeli jurisdiction. The farmers on the West Bank began adopting all of the major agricultural developments, and Israel was known even at the time for a leader in agricultural technologies. And there was a huge boom in agricultural development. Now, the only problem is how are they going to market their products? So Israel made a deal with Jordan so that the Palestinians on the West Bank could continue to market their produce through Jordan and to the Arab world. And I thought, wow, that's a great topic in economic development for my research. So I came to Israel with the hope, and I made a link with the Hebrew University and Harvard so that I could be at the Hebrew University and work on my PhD. But then I could not find the data. I could find data to write an interesting story. I could not find the data to write a doctorate. And very, very disappointedly, okay, I said, I'm going back to the States. What can I do? And then one day I bumped into a man by the name of Dr. Israel Katz, who was the head of Social Security in Israel. He was giving some lecture, and I said, oh, I'll drop in before I leave. And then at the lecture, I looked a little different than the rest of the audience. He called me up and said, what are you doing here? I said, well, I came and I'm going back. And he said, I have a job for you. And he offered me to join the department in the history of the Social Security Administration whose major initial focus was to do the first studies of poverty in Israel. So an amazing, amazing opportunity in the States. I wouldn't have been able to have approached anything like this kind of opportunity with just an MA and almost no research experience, etc. But it was a very small group, only 3 or 4 of us. And I was given the opportunity to be a part of this first study of poverty in Israel. Well, the findings created a huge shockwave throughout the country. Israel was a socialist country. In socialist countries, you don't have much poverty, if at all. And suddenly we found that Israel had a very high rate of poverty, consistent with many of the other developed countries. And this reminded me and brought back my experience before I had come to Israel with the war on poverty in the United States, when the US had discovered suddenly poverty and the efforts to address that war. And I, at the time, had been very involved in demonstrations and things like that. So, okay, so these, first of all, of course, just like in the US and other countries, at first, the findings were attacked and they were denied. It couldn't be. How is this possible? But eventually, the findings began to seep in, and what actually happened, they led to a major series of demonstrations by poor groups in Israel. And so it became a huge national, and they were joined by hundreds of thousands of Israelis who joined in these demonstrations, calling for efforts by the government now to address poverty in Israel. And so I became, and so the government and Dr. Israel Katz and the prime minister at the time set up a national commission that dealt with all aspects, not just with income, all aspects, with education, health, the whole broad very interdisciplinary approach to poverty, with a huge set of recommendations that were actually implemented in 3 or 4 years. And this led to a major revolution. So I was hooked on Israel. And then I from there, I went on to continue my career in Israel. But there then happened one other.
So we'll come back to the full career. And we've heard how you got started to develop that career. But maybe let us hear your views about where we are today with social policy in Israel. And then we'll trace back your own experience. We're going to kind of go backwards a little bit as we want to hear your main ideas. What were the main, or let's put it a little bit differently. What were the main ideas that you tried to push that have emerged and are part of the landscape today?
Okay, over the years, there was, with ups and downs, from government to government, significant development of the various social networks and components of social policy in Israel, and many innovations were introduced at various stages. However, because of the unique structure of Israel's population, there's one problem that Israel, it's a one social statistic in which really Israel is still on the negative side at the top of most Western countries, and that is the rate of poverty. Not in compared to the US, but in compared to most of the European countries. We have a high rate of poverty, and that in many respects it's related, of course, to the levels of income maintenance and things like that, but at the same time, that's very much related to the fact we have very large populations in Israel, which have very large families. And of course, those are the families with very little education and in which women's employment is also very, very limited. And so this has created a very large source of a very significant continuing rates of poverty in Israel. They've improved somewhat, but we still have a major.
So Jack, you're talking about the ultra-religious and maybe the Arab communities?
Yeah, the Arab population, and yeah, the ultra-religious, and for at least a long part of the period, the Jews who came, the large numbers of immigrants from Morocco, Tunisia, and Syria and Iraq also had very large families. So this whole, addressing the link between large family sizes and low human capital and limited labor force participation has been an ongoing theme that Israel has had to address, and remains a very significant issue. Now, with the Jews, the Oriental Jews have made more significant. First of all, their approach to family size has changed. Their approach to education, the women's employment has all changed dramatically. So that group, but the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs have also made progress in these areas, but still only about 30% of Arab women work, which is a very strong, and they still have higher than average family sizes, which also contributes to poverty.
And there was a couple of summers ago a protest movement with a tent city in Tel Aviv. How did that happen? Why did that occur when it occurred? You know what I'm talking about.
I'm not.
It was mainly about crisis in Israel and housing.
Yeah, that wasn't a significant chapter. No,
Okay.
no, I don't really have much to say about that. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So, but my thought is that there were income transfer programs that began to do more to encourage work, and are those still going?
Well, we have our income transfer system that's not particularly focused on encouraging work, and we have child allowances. That's a very big part of our overall financial expenditure on income support, and those are significant. They've gone up and down. Now they're more up than down than they were in the past. So that has helped to reduce some of the poverty among the large families, but it still hasn't been enough to unless the families supplement that by significant earned income to really take them out of poverty.
Now let's talk a little bit about your personal role in these developments. You were the founding director of the Brookdale Institute. Why don't you tell us about that? And that, I think, was Israel Katz played a role in that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. That's both statements are correct. So about 5 years after the poverty report and all of the efforts and social policy changes, et cetera, around that. Dr. Israel Katz, who was the director of Social Security, as I said, called me to his office one day, and he said, Jack, I've been offered to establish a major research institute in Israel and a social research institute in Israel. And I'd like you to come with me. I was also then still a Social Security. And this institute, it would be a very unique government, private sector, voluntary sector collaboration. The partner in that collaboration, the voluntary sector partner, would be an organization called the American Joint Distribution Committee. It's called the JDC. This is a major American NGO that addresses issues in the Jewish world of all kinds, communal development, as well as issues of poverty and related social issues. It does it it's an American effort to assist almost every Jewish community in need in the world. And it also has had over time a very big presence in Israel. A lot of the social infrastructure of social services in Israel over time, since the beginning of the state, was developed by the JDC. So together with an American foundation, they offered Israel Katz to establish this institute as a partnership with the government of Israel. They negotiated with the government at the time this partnership, and it was to be an equal 50-50 financial partnership, as well as participation in the board of the institute. So first of all, this is it was a kind of unusual, unique kind of organization where the government and a private organization formed this kind of partnership. But the other really interesting thing about it is that the representation of the government was to be at the level of ministerial. Otherwise, there were four ministers: Minister of Finance, Minister of Social, no, sorry, not minister, the ministerial, but General Director of the Ministry of Finance, General Director of Social Welfare, General Director of Education, and General Director of Health will be the representatives on this board. Across the aisle from them would sit lay leaders of the JDC, of this major American Jewish NGO.
Yeah,
So
for our
this-
viewers, Jack, Director General would be the top person actually
position in
the
top professional
organ-
position. Top
But the
professional
highest-
position in the ministry.
Reporting to the minister, right?
Right. So first of all, this had many advantages, but first of all, it really focused attention to social issues, and it also created a very unique kind of dialogue with the Jewish communities abroad around addressing Israel's social issues. And so this partnership was established, and over time, by the way, another very important issue is that all the publications of the Institute, or all the work of the Institute, was to be to censor or prevent any kind of publication of the Institute, which was also a very unique aspect for something that's so fully supported by the government. Rega, they
So
just
it
said
was
my
all-
internet connection is unstable.
Yeah,
I
we
just-
lost. So it was all to be published in English and Hebrew. Is that what you were saying, or?
It was
Okay,
not
is it the
censored,
connection?
not censored by the government in any way.
Not censored by the government, okay.
Not censored by the government in any way. And but the other important thing is that it was interministerial. It wasn't one ministry, it's a social service ministry that made the partnership. So this also created a very unique forum for these different ministries to talk together about essential reforms and essential and innovation in the whole area of social services. So this kind of unbelievable kind of creature really changed the dynamic in many respects of many key components of the development of social policy in Israel over time.
Now, you were the first research director or the overall director?
No, Dr. Israel Katz, who was the director, and
Right.
I was the research director. And then over time, when after Dr. Israel Katz, there was a second director for a few years. And then in the late 80s, I became the director of the Institute. And I was the director of the Institute until just 3 years ago when I retired. So I had the opportunity to accompany the development of the Institute for many years.
30 years.
And, Yeah.
30
yeah,
years
yeah,
we're talking.
right.
And what would you say? I was going to ask, what would you say was your proudest achievement?
Wow. The Institute, since it dealt with such a broad range of issues, and also the Institute definitely had a special commitment to minority populations, the Arab Israeli population, immigrants, Ethiopian immigrants, and other groups. It's really, it's very hard for me to answer that question. We were instrumental in development of national health insurance in Israel. We were instrumental in the integration of the massive immigration of Russian and Ethiopian immigrants in the early 90s when hundreds of thousands came pouring into Israel. We developed a national program for children at risk, interministerial program that's created a whole new dynamic of interministerial cooperation in addressing the complex programs of children at risk. We dealt a lot also with employment, and were instrumental in the setting up of a national system of specialized employment centers for the Arab population to deal with their special cultural and language difficulties in integrating into the labor force. So we were instrumental in development of a national program, and later, after the first years of immigration, for education and for promoting the education, supplementary education for Ethiopian immigrants, supplementary supports and enrichment, the whole national program that dramatically changed the success of the Ethiopian Israeli population in Israel. And in the end, we have to remember that in the Ethiopian family, most of the parents were illiterate, so that this was a major educational challenge for them integrating, competing with the rest of their Israeli colleagues.
Now,
yeah.
I was going to say
Just to mention a few.
Yeah.
I just want to mention one other thing, which was really important. In the 90s, we convened a large group of leading Arab academics and professionals and created a broad program for promoting the education of Arab children in Israel. And this was just the convening was very significant because they also had not had any forum to convene and discuss and work together. And then that received a great deal of government support. So it was always, it's not just allocating more money, it was changing the way decisions were made with more involvement, more multidimensional, and more monitoring. And the other critical point that it mentioned is just creating a culture of evaluation. When I came first to Israel in 1974, I don't remember any social program that had been evaluated. So it was creating a program not only better design and collaboration, but of accompanying every single one of these major initiatives with an independent evaluation. Many conducted by the Institute or conducted by some other research group. So the whole area of evidence-based social policy development was our other major theme.
Yes. Now, two other questions related to this. One is, I'm assuming the priorities were, and the goals were set by the board, which consisted of the
Right. Annual program with the priorities, multi-year, 5-year programs with priorities.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's rather unique. I don't think there is any type of institute like that. I mean, the name Brookdale suggests Brookings, and it is well known that when the Democrats are out of power, the politicians, many of them, go to Brookings and they become resident scholars and wait for the next Democratic administration. But that's very different from what you described. And secondly, Brookdale Institute is located in the same place as the Hebrew University schools.
Yes,
and
it's
you
a separate
yourself,
building right near the campus, right?
so there is an academic connection as well, I imagine. You yourself taught the Hebrew University, didn't you?
There were academic connections, but not uniquely with the Hebrew University. We viewed ourselves as open to working with all the universities equally, or depending on their ability to address certain issues. And we certainly had academics, not all of our, the idea was a core staff of people that would be totally committed, not only doing research, but the implementation of research. So this is the core staff. That's their first priority, and did not engage almost at all in publication, academic publication. Their focus was
in the beginning, though, weren't you? Didn't you have an appointment, a professorial appointment at the Hebrew University?
Personally, after a number of years, not immediately, I did pursue an appointment at the Hebrew University. I was assistant professor at the Hebrew University, and I taught courses on social issues and social development, but actually both in the economics department and in the social work department. So yes, but that was a personal thing. That really had nothing to do with the institute.
Well, we're interested in you personally too, Jack. I mean, we're not. We're interested in Jack Habib's life.
No, the other link to the university is not all. So there's the core staff, which had that total commitment to implementation of the findings. And then there were certainly academics from different universities that were asked to participate or interested in participating in various research projects or even initiating a project at the Institute. And so we also involved other academics in that way, yeah.
Now, do you maintain some sort of a emeritus status, some involvement with Brookdale now that you're retired from it?
No. I thought it was best because I'd been there so long. I thought the new director needed his space.
Yeah, and at some point you also became the director of JDC in Israel, right?
Okay, I did actually, at this period of the massive immigration of the Russian and Ethiopian immigrants in the early 90s, I took a leave of absence for about 3 years from the Institute to be head of the sister organization that I mentioned, JDC Israel, which is the organization that develops programs with the government. And that was because of the nature of the period. I mean, it was such the challenge was so great. The Russian immigrants had many issues and they were massive. The Ethiopian immigrants was much smaller, but the change for most of them were illiterate in their native languages, and the effort to successfully integrate them into Israeli society was a very, very special challenge. And also all of the cultures. If they walked into an apartment and if they were to walk into an apartment, is they wouldn't know where to begin. They wouldn't know how to use any of the utilities. I mean, it was really taking people who were living in villages, small. They were not the elite of Ethiopia. They were living in small, remote villages in Ethiopia, and with very little exposure to more modern society. And everything had to be reinvented. No public service could deal with the challenge. You had to reinvent every public service in order for them to begin to serve.
How many were there? How many were there in total?
At the time, when that came, about 30,000 Ethiopian immigrants came into the country, and they were housed in special absorption centers, immigrant absorption centers, where they went through a period of studying Hebrew, a period of literacy, a period of adaptation to more modern society. And actually, another one of the most important programs that the Institute was involved with and evaluated there, and that this is about 10 years later, a major national educational program for Ethiopian students was developed, which provided all kinds of special supplementary assistance, educational assistance, but also enrichment and leadership development. And that's program still going on today. And that was a major game changer for the younger generation, to really leap ahead.
You see go ahead.
I was just going to say the Russian numbers were much higher, but of course they weren't.
Hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
But they were educated.
Right.
They're used to a modern society.
Right.
They had their problems, cultural, language, but and there were many old people also among the immigrants. So we had also significant social care challenge associated with Russian immigration. Yeah. So really,
Jack, with all the experience and experiences that you've had, what changes in your thinking? I mean, you were an economist, got your PhD in economics at Harvard University. You had a notion of economics. Even in your earlier background, you had some thinking based on your Hebraic studies of the Talmud. And but let's stick with economics for a moment. How did your views about incentives and about how to evaluate and how to look at trade-offs, how did that play out in the way you viewed policies and research?
Right. Well, I think one of the important contributions coming from the economic angle background was the whole issue of it's not just effectiveness, it's cost effectiveness. So looking for programs that were really efficient and looking at the costs in relation to the output and not just comparing the outputs, and making that part of the culture within the civil service, within organizations that were developing programs, et cetera. So I think the cost effectiveness was one major contribution. And also the whole notion of incentives impacting on behavior and how to create incentives, whether for social behaviors or not only for economic behaviors, how to create incentives and make them a part of social programs. I think those two particular thoughts enabled us, the Institute, because it was there are not a lot of social or research institutes as well. And at the time, even less. And when I came, there was almost no real academic involvement in social issues in academia at the time. It's developed significantly today. There is, but the whole approach to measuring effectiveness and to cost effectiveness was something that the Institute really had a jump on the other institutes, and we really promoted it and shared it and tried to disseminate it as broadly as possible.
You know, I work at Urban Institute in Washington, research and evaluation and somewhat action group on mostly social affairs, ranging from health to housing to employment. And
I'm an avid reader of all your reports.
when it started in 1968, it was maybe one of two or three, and now there's a whole industry. Has that kind of industry emerged in
No,
Israel?
there are more today, definitely. There are more research institutes today than there were at the time. But overall, in relation to the magnitude and the range of the social issues, we still have a very low overall, I would say, research to product to program ratio. And some of there are economic institutes that will deal a lot with employment, for example, and some of those issues, but you won't find an institute with an economic perspective dealing with the social program for the child at risk. Okay, so that I think is our special niche, to bring not to evaluate the employer, although we do some employment as well, not to evaluate the employment program, which an economist does very well, but to evaluate, to bring this kind of perspective to the programs that which there isn't any generally, except conceptually economic.
You know, so one other thing I think our listeners might find interesting, especially American listeners and watchers, is that politically, what's considered the right of center political parties in Israel tended to be supported by people from lower income backgrounds, whereas the left of center parties, which tend to be in favor of social initiatives, are not, and therefore you might have support from both sides for initiatives that deal with low-income populations. What's your comment on that?
I don't think the interest in addressing social issues has been something that divides the parties in Israel. You're right. Otherwise, the right-wing parties, I cannot say the right-wing parties are less committed to state involvement and to allocating funds to social services than the more central left. And as may be different than many other countries. That's not the way they divide.
No,
they divide more.
At a personal level, you two guys met at Brandeis when you were undergraduates, is that correct?
Right. Yeah, Bob at the time was a very fearsome member of the wrestling team.
Well, Jack and I knew each other a bit, but
not really very much.
A professor by the name of Robert Hartman, may rest in peace, who was at Brookings, reintroduced this at a critical time in my career. But it brought together both of our interests.
And you actually visited, you were a visitor at the Brookdale Institute, and you met your wife there.
I did. She was librarian, and I purposely went to Israel. I was not married at the time, but I was fortunate to interact with Jack and with our first guest, Mayor Cohn, who,
Yeah, Bob did a very important study of the housing market in Israel, and which is still remembered.
yeah, it's, the world is quite different from when we did that report, but I think we could still learn something from it in terms of land policies, especially. Yeah.
Overall, the total amount of research per social or other issues in Israel is very low. And there are huge economies of scale, I think, in being able to invest large amounts of money in research. And so any particular research organization study can have a greater. I want to contradict this. Almost never did we write a report that somebody else came along and contradicted because he had a different findings. It's just, they're not, the research establishment addressing social issues is much more, is too limited for that.
Jack, I met you when
I think
you
we
were a
lost the
grad.
connection.
Do you hear me?
Go ahead. See.
You can hear me. I don't know if Jack can hear me. Jack, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay.
I can hear you now. A minute ago or two ago,
I disappeared. All right. Well, I'll get closer to the computer. I guess I met you when you were a grad student at Harvard, and you had come back from Israel to work on your thesis.
yeah.
What in the end was your thesis topic?
Okay. So what happened, I went abroad, and then my Arab thesis topic, which had been approved, didn't work out. So for about 4 years, I was out of contact with Harvard. But in the meantime, I was one of the major areas of reform as part of the whole impact of the poverty report was on the income maintenance system, and particularly in establishing a system of child allowances in Israel, which didn't exist at the time, or very minimally. And then there was the huge debate that exists in economics, but that's a universal versus a selective, because child allowances go across all families, poor and rich, versus selective, going more to the poor. And wouldn't that be economically inefficient? So I made contact with a professor at the Ethiopian University, a very famous Professor Bruno, a famous economist at the University. And he agreed to guide me in doing a study on the relative efficiency of selective versus universal benefits in addressing poverty. And the study that demonstrated that under circumstances that the universal could be more efficient than the selective. And so I wrote this thesis, and then I went back to Harvard one day. I made an appointment with the director of the Department of Economics and said, well, I've been going for a while, but here's a thesis. This had not, of course, had not been processed through any kind of committee of any kind. And he said, wow, you have a thesis, but where have you been? And so he hummed, and they had a meeting and this and that. And they decided, okay, you have to be in residence now for about 4 months. We'll assign to you two professors to review the thesis. And then we'll see how it works. So they reviewed this thesis. They liked it. They gave me comments and changes to make. I think the name of Professor Bruno might have been very helpful in this regard. And they gave me a doctorate.
Terrific.
Terrific.
I mean, these things shouldn't happen to people. This was totally.
Well, you were an exception in many different respects, right?
Yeah.
Exceptional.
So Jack, how did you learn Hebrew?
Good and for bad, for good and for bad.
For good. For the most.
How did you learn Hebrew? How did you? One of the things we've not talked about the fact that you as an American were coming to Israel, where the language is
Right.
Hebrew, and all of the discussions among policymakers and researchers mostly would be in Hebrew. How did
So I didn't, Hebrew, in Israel, we have a system for new immigrant study. Hebrew, it's called an Ulpan system. And you go there and you sit for a number of months or many months or year, etc. And you study Hebrew. I never went to an Ulpan. I had some I knew how to read Hebrew because of some Jewish education in my early years. So I knew how to read Hebrew, of course, with vowels, not without vowels, but I really did not know a lot of Hebrew. So I owe my Hebrew education to the series of Israeli girlfriends I had.
okay.
Culminating in your wife.
I mean, Israel was so cosmopolitan and there were so many different peoples. So I had a Yemenite girlfriend and a Moroccan girlfriend and a Romanian girlfriend and a Russian girlfriend. And
you had to have a common language, huh?
Right. I pieced together some Hebrew.
Well, in the end, it should be said that you married one of those girlfriends, and she was somebody who had gone to high school in the United States.
Right. That was a bit later. Yeah.
But did the absence of Hebrew didn't seem to affect you that much?
No, it wasn't. Not that much. I had help. All the time, and some people, people Hebrew speaking, English Hebrew speakers were working with me all the time. And but the first research at the National Insurance and Social Security Administration of Israel, I was not in the lead there. So the other people were in the lead. So I was doing more of the analysis and things like that. Looking at the international, I had the advantage. I could look at the international literature and see how other countries are measuring poverty and compare and things like that. So I had a lot of support, but it was a challenge, but I had a lot of support. I didn't. And I mean, even then when I was doing research reports after at Brookdale, I don't think I ever wrote those initial reports. I was part of the team that contributed to the thinking, the analysis, but I didn't really write them. I always had Hebrew speakers working with me.
Well, that helps.
Right.
That certainly helps.
Well,
so
as we draw closer to the conclusion of this, I want to turn the focus back to broad issues. And I know that you, like many other citizens of Israel, are concerned about prospects for peace with other countries in the Middle East and with the Palestinians.
Right.
What's your view?
That we need peace. That's number one. And we should try to do a lot to pursue peace. With the Arab countries, you all are aware of the recent developments and the outpouring of interest and actual actions to develop peaceful relations with Israel. And now we see Zoom sessions with Israelis and people from Bahrain and the UAE and other Arab countries discussing issues together. And there's a huge now investment of the UAE wants to buy out one of Israel's major gas companies now. And there are I heard a number, there are hundreds of Israeli entrepreneurs already in these countries making economic relations. But getting back to the basic issue of relations with the Palestinians, and that's the basis for the peace process. I don't know. There were two major attempts in which agreements were almost reached, as you remember historically. And in fact, there was just a major, I can send it to you, actually, there was just a major leader from the UAE, one of their distinguished older leaders, who made a whole presentation about because he accompanied one of those efforts with Clinton. He was there throughout the entire process, accompanied the Palestinians. And he indicated that he sat towards the end, a meeting with Arafat, so you agree? He said yes. And he really thought that he should accept the agreement that was being proposed. And then Arafat the next day left the country and never signed the agreement. So there were chances that the Palestinians, that's my opinion, the Palestinians had for some kind of a fair peace. Now, in the absence of that, the right-wing groups in Israel have become, and who oppose the peace process, who want to maintain their territories, have become stronger over time. If we have had these peace agreements, maybe there never would have been a right-wing prime minister of Israel in subsequent years. I mean, it could have changed the whole dynamic. So, what are the possibilities now? I don't know. My hope was that there are many Israeli leaders who want to do the right thing. There are those who don't, who don't want to pursue peace. And my hope is that the international community will help those who don't want to do peace to change their mind.
I'm sure they would say they like peace. It's on what terms? But what are the terms of the peace? But
Right.
so
I'm not sure that all of them, the terms of peace are, let's say, beyond something that the Palestinians could accept. But there are others who definitely, I think, were prepared to offer the Palestinians terms like they did like that were offered in the past, that the Palestinians should be able to accept. It's very, very unfortunate. All the missed opportunities is very, very unfortunate.
But your
I don't think
involvement has been with the Israeli Arabs, is that correct? As far as social policy is concerned.
Yeah, definitely. Throughout the Institute's work, we've been a leader in involving in addressing issues of the Israeli Arab population and in creating dialogue, creating national conferences where Arabs and Jews come together, and we continue that effort. We've had senior members of our staff from the Arab community. Problem is they keep stealing them away from us because Arab leaders of professional leaders, there tends to be a big demand for them. But there has been, and Bob and I have been working on this, there has been, to document it in the last, let's say 10 years, there has been very, very significant progress in reducing gaps between Arabs and Jews in Israel, and very meaningful progress. And I think the beautiful part of it, or one beautiful part, is that it's the result of government initiatives. It's the result of the enhanced and very significant involvement of Jewish communities abroad in the progress of the Arabs in Israel. And particularly from not only the United States, the UK, those are the larger communities, and a large growth of Jewish Arab NGOs who work together to promote the benefit of the Arab community. And the president of Israel, who is now retiring in a few months, during his tenure, a 5-year tenure, committed himself to what he calls bringing the different tribes of Israel together. And the tribes are not just Jewish tribes, the different Jewish tribes, but it's the various Jewish tribes, the various groups in Israel together. And he had a very unique commitment to promoting progress of the Arab-Israeli population. So there have been a number of forces that have contributed to this, and also the right-wing Netanyahu government for many years, over a long period within the last 10 years, also prioritized Israeli Arabs, the progress of Israeli Arabs. And there's been a whole set of very innovative, for example, one of the things that was established several years ago was a special employment network, employment exchange, you would call the US, employment center network for Arab Israelis. They could also go to the general one, but a special one that focuses on their special cultural needs, their special needs, and that has made a huge difference in the access, for example, of the Arab population to employment. So, and the university system in Israel has made spectacular progress because of a very, very innovative, multidimensional program to promote the entrance, the acceptance, and the success of Arab students in Israel. So there are many, many forces in Israel that are very committed to integrating the Arab population.
And we hope that the Abraham Accords, which link Israel in a very peaceful way to a number of Arab countries, might even expand on that. I would think that an Israeli Arab entrepreneur would be particularly capable of having an impact in that regard. So maybe we'll end this particular interview on this note of hope. It's a note that often doesn't get the headlines, at least internationally, maybe not even in Israel. But it's important on the ground work. And I certainly, and I expect to be as well, salute you, Jack, for all your contributions to helping people in Israel and to making Israel a better place.
Now, Jack did get a Lifetime Achievement Award from what organization, Jack?
That's on a slightly different topic, the International Association of Gerontology.
Oh, so there's another area.
This was a number of years ago, and also actually from the some other organizations too, but that's not here nor there. So I feel like the most fortunate person in the world to have had these opportunities to make this contribution and to work with so many wonderful people, and feel like I'm a very lucky man.
Well, you, knowing your wife and family, I would say you are very lucky in that regard too.
That's for sure.
Well, thanks again, Jack. And
it's wonderful to have such wonderful friends. That's equally important.
Yes.
All right. Well,
we've completed the circle.
Mutual Appreciation Society. Right. But we're really glad to see this hopeful sign. There are challenges. If there weren't challenges, we wouldn't have as much to do. And we're really, as I said, very appreciative of your contribution to dealing with these challenges. And we hope our listeners and viewers enjoyed today's episode of Ideas and Lives.
Well, we had our ending slogan is Sei gesund.
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund. Okay.
See you later.
And let there be peace. Shalom.
Shalom. Exactly.
Okay.